So imagine building a company from absolute scratch. I mean, picture 15 years of just relentless back-breaking work.
Right, the classic provider story.
Exactly. You employ 40 people, you make sure the payroll clears every single Friday, you pay every tax demanded of you, and, you still manage to coach your son's Little League baseball team on Saturday mornings.
You're checking all the boxes. You're doing everything right.
Doing everything society asks of a man. You are, by every traditional metric, the protector, the provider, the competent builder.
Right.
But then imagine coming home on a random Tuesday afternoon to find a single piece of paper pinned to your front door, and it's a restraining order.
Oh, man.
Yeah. The allegation on that paper is exactly one paragraph long, and the only evidence provided is just a signature, your wife's signature.
And before you even have a chance to, stand before a judge or say a single word in your own defense, the machinery of the state has already processed you.
It's terrifying. Within 72 hours, your bank accounts are entirely frozen. Your name is placed on a state registry. You have been physically removed from your own property.
Just gone, instantly.
Instantly. And the therapist that the court assigned to your kids has already sat them down and explained, using this very calm clinical tone, that their father has some dangerous patterns he needs to work on.
Based on one single paragraph.
Based on one paragraph. So welcome to our deep dive. Today, we are exploring a phenomenon that is, it's incredibly difficult to articulate, but it's practically inescapable for millions of men navigating modern society right now.
It really is everywhere.
It is. If you're a man listening to this, especially if you've been in the men's rights spaces, the red-pilled spaces, and you've been looking around at your workplace or the family courts or just culture in general, and you have this creeping sensation that your basic competence is somehow being treated as a liability.
Like it's a threat.
Right, like your desire to provide is suddenly toxic, or your role as a father is treated as this debt you can never repay. Well, this deep dive is tailored exactly for you.
It's that exact sensation of waking up and realizing the rules of gravity have been totally inverted overnight. Like the structures you relied on to be objective are suddenly operating under a completely different, almost alien set of instructions.
And deciphering those new instructions, that is our mission today. We are doing an extensive review of this fascinating, deeply incisive new ebook. It's titled Marxist Mustard Seed, From Resentment Grows a Grapevine by Conrad Riker.
Such a powerful title, honestly.
It really is. And Riker provides this meticulously detailed history of how the core institutions of our society were, basically captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies. We are going to map out the exact vocabulary and the historical architecture he presents. But before we get completely lost in those historical weeds, we do need to establish some ground rules for today's discussion.
Yeah, that is very important. This requires a very clear neutrality disclaimer for anyone tuning in. Because Riker's book touches on some of the most highly charged, explosive political and cultural concepts of our time.
Oh, absolutely.
We are spanning left-wing and right-wing cultural battlegrounds, touching on gender dynamics, economics, law, institutional power. So we want to explicitly state to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides today.
Right, no sides.
We are not endorsing the political viewpoints of this content. Our job is simply to impartially report on the ideas contained in the source material. We are serving strictly as your analytical guides to help you understand Riker's intricate arguments.
We are literally just the mirror reflecting the text today. And speaking of understanding this for yourself, I highly urge you to take a second to like and subscribe to our show right now.
It really helps us keep doing these deep dives.
Yeah, it does. Furthermore, if you want to follow along with us or dig deeper into this whole framework, you need to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook, Marxist Mustard Seed. You should also follow the author for his ongoing analysis on Substack at Conrad Riker, and over on YouTube at Conrad Riker.
So to really grasp the gravity of Riker's argument, we have to start with that visceral story you opened with, that man who lost everything in 72 hours.
Yeah, it's such a brutal way to open a book.
But Riker places this anecdote right in the preface for a reason, because it isn't an outlier.
Yeah.
He argues it's the intended outcome.
Right. He calls it a political theology in miniature. And I was trying to wrap my head around this, and the closest mechanical comparison I could think of is like an autoimmune disease.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right, because if you look at how the human body works, the white blood cells are the defense mechanism. They are designed to attack foreign invaders and protect the healthy tissue.
Exactly, they keep you alive.
But when someone develops an autoimmune disease, the programming gets corrupted. So the white blood cells suddenly look at the healthy, functioning organs and they register them as a threat. The body starts aggressively dismantling the very cells keeping it alive, with no due process.
It just attacks itself.
Yes. And Riker is essentially arguing that the law, the therapy industry, the family courts, these are supposed to be the immune system of a functioning civilization. But they've been reprogrammed. They are now actively attacking the competent builder.
That analogy tracks perfectly with the mechanics Riker outlines. The system hasn't broken down,
Yeah.
It has been given a new prime directive.
A completely new set of instructions.
Yeah, and to understand that prime directive, Riker argues we have to look past the policies themselves and actually examine the psychological engine driving them. He calls this engine the kernel of the movement, and it is fueled by a very specific concept, which is resentiment.
And that's spelled with an S in the middle, right, from the French, because it's not just the standard English word resentment. It has a much deeper philosophical weight to it.
Correct. The concept was heavily explored by the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche when he was diagnosing what he called slave morality.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and Riker takes this philosophical concept and maps it directly onto modern institutional capture. He defines resentment as a process of psychological alchemy.
Psychological alchemy. That's a great phrase.
It is the exact mechanism where a person's private, unconfessed inadequacy is transmuted into a moral accusation against the world.
The transmutation of inadequacy into moral accusation. Let's actually slow down and pull that apart for a second, because if we don't understand that, literally the rest of the book doesn't make sense.
Right, it's the foundation of everything he says.
So how does that transmutation actually work in practice, like on a human level?
Well, think about the fundamental human experience of encountering someone who is just more capable than you.
Okay.
Suppose you encounter a man who is incredibly disciplined. He has mastered a difficult skill, he has built a thriving business, he has a stable household.
The guy who has it all together.
Exactly. The healthy, natural response to encountering that superiority is emulation, or at least, a quiet acknowledgement of your own shortcomings. You look in the mirror, you confess that you haven't worked as hard, and you try to improve.
Right. But that requires a lot of humility, and it requires actually taking on the burden of your own failure, which is hard.
It's very hard. And resentment is the psychological refusal to take on that burden. Instead of looking in the mirror, the person incubates the wound. They let the envy fester and harden into a comprehensive worldview.
Oh, I see.
The psychological alchemy occurs when they decide that their failure isn't their fault and the other man's success isn't his merit. The competent man didn't build his business through discipline. He built it through exploitation.
Ah, so he isn't better. He is an oppressor.
Yes. The universe isn't a meritocracy in their eyes. It's a rigged game designed to keep the marginalized down.
Wow, okay. So the raw, ugly feeling of, I'm jealous of what you have built, that feeling puts on a suit and tie and becomes, you stole what I rightfully deserve, and justice demands you be punished.
That is exactly it.
It takes a personal vice, like envy, and cloaks it in the language of ultimate virtue.
And that is the exact historical tracing Riker performs, taking us all the way back to the year 1848 to the publication of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx.
Right, the big shift. And Riker's portrait of Marx is crucial here because he doesn't paint him primarily as an economist, does he?
No, not at all.
He paints him almost as the patron saint of this psychological alchemy. I mean, Riker points out some brutal biographical details about Marx. Here's this 30-year-old man with a doctorate in philosophy.
Who had never managed a factory in his life.
Right. Never managed a factory. He never balanced a corporate ledger. He was notoriously incapable of managing his own household budget, just constantly relying on his wealthy friend Friedrich Engels to bail him out of debt.
He basically spent his days sitting in a London reading room.
Yeah. So Riker asks the obvious question. Did a guy with zero practical economic experience suddenly discover the objective, hidden mathematical laws of human history?
And the book argues absolutely not. Marx didn't invent the concept of exploitation. I mean, child laborers in textile mills and tenant farmers knew about exploitation centuries before Marx was even born.
Sure, they lived it.
Right. Riker asserts that Marx's actual world-changing achievement was rhetorical, not economic. Marx took this ancient, simmering impulse of resentment and dressed it in the imposing robes of, quote, objective historical science.
He translated a feeling into a finding. That is incredible.
Precisely. If a factory worker looks at the factory owner and hates him for having more money, that is just envy. It is as old as the story of Cain and Abel.
Right, just basic jealousy.
But when Marx provides a dense theoretical framework, when he calls that feeling class consciousness and wraps it in a narrative of inevitable historical materialism and stamps it with the word scientific, the entire psychological landscape shifts.
The resentment is suddenly laundered. The worker isn't a bitter, envious person anymore. He is an enlightened revolutionary diagnosing a systemic flaw.
His hatred is no longer a sin he needs to confess.
No, it is proof of his moral superiority. That is the mustard seed Riker is talking about in the title, the transplantation of a personal grievance into systemic soil.
And Riker details how catastrophic this was when it actually moved from the reading room to the real world. He looks at the Parisian uprisings of 1848 and the Bolshevik Revolution in Petrograd in 1917.
Let's actually look at what happened on the ground during those revolutions, because this is where Riker's thesis really crystallizes for me. Like in 1848 Paris, the workers rise up and build these massive barricades in the streets. Right?
Yeah, the classic image of the revolution.
But Riker points out something I had never heard before. Within a matter of months, the revolutionaries were turning on the skilled tradesmen and the engineers who had actually designed and built those very barricades.
They turned on their own builders.
They were imprisoning the competent men of their own movement.
And we see the exact same pattern amplified 1,000 times in Russia in 1917. When the Bolsheviks seized the factories, they didn't just remove the wealthy owners. They immediately turned their violence on the competent floor managers, the qualified technicians, the engineers.
The very people whose technical expertise was the only thing standing between the workers and mass starvation. I mean, if your goal is to empower the working class, why would you execute the guy who knows how to keep the electrical grid running?
Because, as Riker argues, the underlying goal was never actually about running the factories more efficiently. The goal was to run them without the competent men who built them.
Without them? Wow.
The very existence of those competent men was an unbearable psychological insult to the resentful. The revolutionaries were perfectly willing to let the machinery rust and let millions starve, so long as they no longer had to endure the humiliation of seeing someone more capable than themselves in charge.
So resentment, not economics, was the true engine.
Exactly. The factory was just incidental. The destruction of the competent builder was the point.
Okay, well, this brings up a massive, glaring mystery then.
It's that.
If this ideology is so inherently destructive, if it actively dismantles the competent builders, leading directly to the gulags, to mass starvation in the Soviet Union, and to the total economic collapse of half the globe, how on earth did it survive?
That is the question, isn't it?
Why wasn't it permanently discredited and buried? How did an ideology that starved millions in the 20th century manage to infiltrate modern human resources departments, corporate boardrooms, and family courts today?
That is the pivotal question of the entire text. And to answer it, Riker takes us to a very specific moment in history, November 1989.
The fall of the Berlin Wall.
Yes. Let's dig into the mechanics of this transition. When the Berlin Wall fell, the evidence was undeniable. The grand economic argument of Marxism was completely, permanently bankrupt.
I mean, you had 8 decades of forced collectivization, a body count approaching 100 million people, and what was the result?
Rusting factories. Citizens waiting in line for hours just to buy a loaf of bread.
And a secret police force terrorizing the populace. Riker notes that the actual working class, the mechanics, the plumbers, the electricians, they didn't want the romanticized withering away of the state. They just wanted a used Toyota and a fully stocked supermarket.
Exactly. The economic vehicle had broken down beyond repair. Sensible people looked at the collapse of the Soviet bloc and celebrated. Western conservatives essentially threw a massive victory parade, believing they had permanently won the ideological war.
But Riker argues they were wrong.
Very wrong. Because while the conservatives were busy celebrating the end of history, the academic left executed one of the most brilliant, silent, strategic retreats in modern political history.
Riker calls it the silent blockage. Right?
Yes, because the underlying psychological engine, the resentment, that slow fermentation of envy into moral conviction, it was still humming. Didn't care about economics. Economics was just the host body.
Was just the excuse.
Right. When the economic host died in 1989, the mustard seed simply changed soil. It migrated from the factory floor to the faculty lounge.
Okay, but how does an ideology built entirely around class warfare survive without classes? I mean, if the workers are happy, who is rebelling?
Well, they survived by preserving the structural template of Marxism while completely swapping out the cast of characters.
Just a casting change.
Exactly. The core template of this ideology isn't actually about capital. It is about binary conflict. It operates on the absolute assumption that society is strictly divided into two immovable categories, the oppressor and the oppressed.
Right, that binary is key.
In this framework, all institutions, all laws, all cultural norms, and all standards of merit are nothing more than camouflage used by the oppressors to maintain their unearned dominance.
So, if the economic proletariat, the factory worker, refuses to play the role of the revolutionary vanguard because he just wants to buy a house and be left alone, you have to invent a new proletariat.
Precisely. And that new proletariat was identity. The academic left shifted the entire axis of grievance from class to inherent identity markers. And Riker points out that the architectural blueprint for this shift was formalized in the exact same year the Berlin Wall fell.
Oh, wow. The timing is crazy. 1989.
1989. A legal scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw coined a term that would become the master key for this new era: intersectionality.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of intersectionality because this is where the modern trap was set. From what Riker explains, it didn't start as a grand cultural theory, right?
No, not initially.
It started as a highly specific legal framework regarding employment discrimination.
That's right. Crenshaw was analyzing a specific legal case involving black women at a General Motors plant. She was arguing that traditional anti-discrimination law couldn't address their situation because it treated race and gender as mutually exclusive categories rather than overlapping ones.
Which makes sense in a narrow legal context.
Right. But within a decade, this narrow legal critique was extracted from the courtroom and expanded into the grand unified theory of the New Left.
It became the universal solvent. Under intersectionality, the economic proletariat was permanently replaced by the intersectional client. Society was mapped out into this incredibly complex matrix of interlocking oppressions based on race, gender, sexuality, and ability.
And here's the critical mechanical shift. Under classical Marxism, a bourgeois factory owner could, theoretically, give away his factory, abandon his class, and join the revolution.
Right, like Engels did. His original sin was economic, so it was curable.
But under intersectional theory, your oppressor status is tied to your immutable identity. If you belong to the designated oppressor category, your guilt is permanent. It cannot be negotiated away, it cannot be cured by good behavior, and it cannot be disproven by your individual actions.
Okay, I want to jump in and heavily challenge this because I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a skeptical listener here.
Sir, let's hear it.
I understand the theoretical link Riker is making, but practically speaking, Riker claims that modern corporate HR departments and diversity initiatives are literally just the Soviet commissar system wearing a corporate lanyard.
He does say that.
That feels like an enormous hyperbolic leap. I mean, a Soviet commissar had the backing of state violence. He could point a rifle at your head and ship you to a gulag in Siberia where you would freeze to death. An HR rep named Linda sending out a mandatory calendar invite for an unconscious bias seminar is annoying, sure, but she isn't holding a gun to my head. How does Riker bridge the massive gap between physical state terror and corporate bureaucracy?
It is a critical distinction to make, and Riker bridges it by explaining the evolution of administrative violence. You are right. Linda in HR does not have a gulag. But she doesn't need one.
Why not?
Because the objective of the Soviet commissar was to enforce absolute ideological compliance by threatening physical death. The objective of the modern HR apparatus is to enforce absolute ideological compliance by threatening economic and social death.
So it's a change in the technology of destruction, not a change in the underlying objective.
Exactly. Riker points out that the old left needed to seize the physical means of production. They had to storm the Winter Palace, take over the steel mills, control the grain supply.
The physical stuff.
But the new left realized that in an information economy, physical capital is secondary. They don't need to seize the steel mill. They just need to seize the means of language, the means of reputation, and the means of credentialing.
They storm the HR department instead of the Winter Palace. That is wild.
And once they control the HR department, they control the economic lifeblood of the competent man. The mechanism of control is no longer the secret police, it is the accusation.
The accusation.
And because the system has already determined your guilt in advance based on your intersectional identity category, the accusation does not require hard evidence.
Right, because you're already guilty.
Exactly. A vague complaint to HR about your tone, an anonymous rumor, a screenshot of a social media post taken out of context, these are entirely sufficient to trigger a bureaucratic investigation.
And these internal corporate investigations, they operate completely outside the bounds of constitutional law.
Completely.
There is no due process. There is no presumption of innocence. You don't have the right to face your accuser. The designated bourgeois today, the oppressor class, is simply the competent man, the provider, the father.
Yep.
The machine realizes it doesn't need to use physical violence when it can just fire you, revoke your professional license, destroy your reputation in the digital public square, and package the whole execution under the sterile label of accountability.
That is Riker's exact synthesis. The resentful have built a flawless institutional machinery designed to process compliance, not competence. And the ultimate crushing irony of this system is that it is entirely funded by the productive labor of the very men it targets.
Yeah, that part is mind-bending.
The competent builders are generating the revenue that pays the salaries of the administrative class that is actively plotting their destruction.
Which opens up an entirely new layer of the book. For this massive migration to work for this identity-based grievance machine, to move from an obscure academic theory into the HR department of every Fortune 500 company, it needed physical hosts.
It needed a home.
Right, it had to capture the institutions. Let's look at exactly how these institutions were captured and repurposed. Riker introduces this concept of the grievance annuity. Can you break down the mechanics of what he means by that?
The grievance annuity is arguably the most powerful economic and structural insight in the book.
Okay, how does it work?
Well, in traditional finance, an annuity is a financial product where you invest a lump sum of capital, and in return, it pays out a steady stream of income over time.
Like retirement income.
Right. Riker applies this concept to cultural wounds. He defines the grievance annuity as the systemic process where a single instance of injury, whether it is an actual historical injustice, a perceived slight, or an entirely fabricated claim, is monetized into a permanent, high-yielding Social Security program.
Monetizing a wound.
Yes. The bearer of the grievance deposits their victimhood into the cultural bank.
Okay.
In return, they receive continuous compounding payouts.
And what do those payouts look like?
These payouts take the form of unearned deference in conversations, immunity from objective performance standards, the immediate presumption of truth in any conflict, and the absolute right to accuse others without providing evidence.
But every annuity requires an institution to manage it and guarantee those payouts.
And that is where the captured institutions come in. The university humanities departments, the corporate DEI offices, the massive diversity consulting firms, they act as the servicing agencies for the grievance annuity.
So they're basically managing the fund.
They function as tax collectors,
Yeah.
extracting capital and moral deference from the productive class to fund the aggrieved class.
But here's the terrifying catch that Riker points out. This specific annuity is designed so that it never matures.
Never.
It never reaches a point where the debt is paid, the account is closed, the lump sum settlement is handed over, and society gets to move on.
It cannot mature because the servicing agencies have a structural financial imperative to ensure the grievance never heals. Think about the incentive structure here.
Right, follow the money.
If you are a university department head whose entire budget, staffing, and social authority rely on combating a specific form of systemic oppression, the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen to you is the eradication of that oppression.
If the wound heals, the wound management industry goes bankrupt.
Exactly.
If equality of opportunity is actually achieved, what happens to the thousands of highly paid administrators whose sole job is to monitor inequity? They lose their salaries. So the institution must ensure that the grievance becomes a chronic, untreatable, terminal condition requiring endless bureaucratic management.
Resolution is the enemy because resolution stops the dividend payments.
Wow.
Who would liquidate an annuity? That is Riker's rhetorical question, and it explains why the definitions of oppression continually expand. To justify their continued existence, these institutions must constantly lower the threshold of what constitutes a grievance.
Right, because they run out of real grievances.
Exactly. What was once defined as systemic legal discrimination gets redefined as explicit bias, which is then redefined as unconscious bias, which is then redefined as a microaggression.
The goalposts are just strapped to a rocket ship.
They really aren't.
To prove just how intellectually compromised and ideologically captured these university systems, what Riker calls the university ducts, have become, the book brings up a fascinating real-world case study, the Sokal Squared hoax from 2018.
Oh, this is a brilliant example.
If you are a listener and you haven't heard of Sokal Squared, you really need to brace yourself because the mechanics of this are unbelievable.
It is perhaps the most devastating indictment of the modern academic peer review system in existence. So 3 scholars, James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose, and Peter Boghossian, They set out to empirically test the intellectual rigor of leading academic journals in fields like cultural studies, gender studies, and critical race theory.
Because they suspected that these fields had abandoned objective truth in favor of ideological compliance?
Right. So they decided to run a sting operation. They didn't just submit one bad paper. Over the course of 10 months, they wrote 20 completely fabricated, intentionally absurd, methodologically unhinged papers.
They were trying to see what they could get away with.
They wanted to see just how insane an idea could be, provided it was wrapped in the correct intersectional vocabulary, and concluded that Western, male-dominated structures were oppressive.
And the results were staggering.
Several of these leading peer-reviewed journals accepted and published these fabricated papers.
We have to give some specific examples of what actually got past the peer reviewers, because it proves Riker's point about the alchemy of resentment perfectly.
Go for it.
Okay, so one of the papers that got published was an observational study of dog parks.
Dog parks.
Yes. The paper seriously argued that dog parks are breeding grounds for canine rape culture, and proposed that men should be forced to interact with dogs in a submissive manner to cure their inherent transphobia.
And the peer reviewers didn't flag this as a joke. They praised it.
They praised it. It is insane.
But it gets even darker when you look at the mechanics of their most infamous submission. The trio literally took a chapter from Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, one of the most reviled texts in human history, and systematically rewrote it.
They rewrote Mein Kampf.
They removed the specific racial targeting and replaced it with modern intersectional feminist language, targeting men and competence instead.
They fed the exact architecture of genocidal rhetoric through an academic thesaurus, and a premier academic journal accepted it. That is terrifying.
Riker uses this to demonstrate a chilling reality. These departments produce no actual knowledge. They possess no mechanism for detecting truth or falsehood. They exist purely as ideological ammunition factories.
Just churning out compliance.
When a student graduates from these programs, the credential they receive is not proof that they can think critically or solve complex problems. The degree is essentially a loyalty card.
A loyalty card.
It proves that the student has been successfully processed, that their capacity for independent reasoning has been neutralized, and that they can be trusted to reliably repeat the correct ideological vocabulary when they enter corporate HR.
And Riker points out that this abandonment of reality goes back much further than 2018. He traces the rot back decades, citing this mind-bending example from 1975.
Yes, the Architecture Conference.
Right. There was a feminist academic conference on architecture held in New York.
At the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. Riker highlights this event to show how the logic of resentment cannot confine itself just to social complaints. Its ultimate target is physical reality itself.
So what happened there?
Well, at this conference, credentialed academics stood up and argued with total seriousness that right angles, load-bearing walls, and structural steel frames were inherently expressions of patriarchal domination.
They declared war on the right angle because it is rigid and linear and masculine. I mean, you can't make this up.
They advocated for a new paradigm of organic or female architecture. They proposed that buildings should conceptually yield. They literally used the phrase that buildings should conceptually menstruate.
How does a building conceptually menstruate? What does that even mean?
It doesn't mean anything in the physical world.
Exactly. Riker points out the fatal, hilarious, and terrifying flaw here. Nobody has ever built a functioning suspension bridge out of conceptual menstruation.
No, they have not.
When you look at the modern world, what do you see? You have the Florence Cathedral, the Brooklyn Bridge, the massive electrical grids powering our cities. These were built by men who understood that right angles exist because the laws of physics are absolute.
Right.
Gravity does not negotiate with your identity. Gravity does not care about your grievances.
And on the other side of the ledger, what does the ideology of resentment build? It builds equity audit reports, diversity strategic plans, and bureaucratic committees, entirely produced by administrative apparatchiks who have never welded a steel beam, poured concrete, or built a single physical structure in their lives.
It is the ultimate revenge of the incapable against the physical constraints of reality.
Well said.
But if the university duct is the factory that manufactures this ideological ammunition, how is it deployed to control the broader population? How does the system force people who know this is absurd to actually play along?
Riker says the enforcement mechanism is the media bile sac.
The media bile sac. And to explain the mechanics of this, he uses a very modern, highly controversial case study The October 2020 Hunter Biden laptop story.
This is a crucial case study, and it's important to note Riker uses it not to make a partisan point about American elections, but to observe institutional coordination in motion. He wants the reader to look at the plumbing of the system.
So set the stage for us. What happened in October 2020?
Weeks before a pivotal election, the New York Post published a bombshell story based on emails and photographs recovered from a laptop abandoned by Hunter Biden. The contents of that laptop were verified, cryptographically authenticated, and corroborated by multiple first-hand witnesses.
So it was a true story, quantifiably, provably true.
A completely true story. But let's look at the mechanical response of the media bile sack. Within hours of publication, Twitter actively locked the account of the New York Post, one of the oldest newspapers in the country, preventing anyone from sharing the link.
Unprecedented censorship.
Facebook explicitly announced they were deliberately reducing the distribution of the article in their algorithm.
And then came the institutional artillery, right? A coordinated coalition of 51 former high-ranking intelligence officers signed and released a public letter stating that the laptop had all the earmarks of a Russian information operation.
Following that cue, major legacy media outlets universally declared the story was debunked disinformation. The prominent fact-checking organizations like PolitiFact stamped it with a false rating.
The story was completely suffocated at the exact moment it mattered most. And then, the punchline. 2 years later, long after the election was over, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and every other major outlet quietly confirmed that the laptop was, in fact, entirely genuine. But there were no massive front-page retractions. None of the 51 intelligence officers lost their security clearances. The apparatus had performed exactly as designed.
This sequence of events leads Riker to a profound observation about the modern concept of fact-checking. Riker argues that the phrase fact-check has been completely weaponized.
How so?
It carries the moral perfume of objective laboratory science. It implies a sterile, impartial environment where propositions are rigorously tested against empirical evidence. But in practical reality, modern fact-checking operates as a political gag order.
Right, and Rager points out the financial plumbing behind this, which is fascinating. He traces the funding of the International Fact-Checking Network, the body that actually certifies these fact-checkers, and notes it was heavily subsidized by partisan billionaires, including Pierre Omidyar and George Soros' Open Society Foundation.
So a politically aligned writer, funded by politically aligned foundations, renders a completely subjective verdict, and then the tech monopolies enforce that verdict by digitally erasing the offending content.
The truth doesn't actually matter to the machine at all. What matters is the performance of compliance. They don't need you to privately believe that the laptop is fake. They just need to flex their power to force you to nod along and accept the label they apply to it.
The mechanism operates entirely on institutional standing rather than evidence. If you attempt to challenge the fact-checker with empirical data, you aren't engaging in a debate about facts. You are immediately accused of committing heresy against the consensus of reliable sources.
And the system's definition of a reliable source is simply any source that unquestioningly regurgitates the approved narrative.
Exactly.
Okay, let's synthesize where we are in this architecture. The university duct manufactures the ideological ammunition. The media bile sack enforces the narrative and punishes public dissent. The corporate HR thermostat regulates your economic behavior.
Yes, that's the macro level.
But where does the average, everyday man actually feel the deepest, sharpest teeth of this machine? Like, where does it get personal?
According to Riker, he feels it in his own home. He experiences the full force of the machine through the ongoing gender war, and specifically through the systematic, state-sponsored recoding of fatherhood.
We are entering the territory of the gender war. And I found this section of the book incredibly intense because it flips our standard understanding of tyranny on its head. Riker asserts that the primary weapon used against men in this gender war isn't brute force.
No, nobody is holding a blade to your throat to make you comply.
The weapon of choice is the weaponization of compassion.
This is perhaps Riker's most brilliant psychological insight. He argues that men have a natural hardwired instinct to protect and provide for those who are vulnerable.
That protective instinct is core to masculinity.
Right, and the ideology of resentment hacks that exact instinct. Men are systematically conditioned to feel that resisting an unfair premise or demanding objective standards is itself a form of cruelty.
They make you feel like a bad guy for wanting fairness.
Yes, the system captures the concept of compassion and surgically severs it from the concept of justice.
Compassion without justice is just tyranny in a soft sweater.
That's a great way to put it. When compassion is redefined to mean nothing more than appeasing whatever the most fragile or resentful person in the room demands, every institution begins to rot from the inside out.
It's toxic empathy.
Consider the dynamic in a modern workplace or a university committee. A man who demands hard evidence before a decision is made, who demands proportionality in punishment, who asks for basic due process, he isn't engaged in a debate anymore. He is instantly pathologized.
He is labeled as lacking empathy. His defense of objective truth is relabeled as emotional hostility.
Exactly.
I was thinking about how to visualize this concept of equity, which is the ultimate buzzword for this weaponized compassion. It's often sold as a synonym for fairness, but mechanically it operates completely differently.
How do you picture it?
Well, imagine a factory floor with a conveyor belt where workers are assembling parts. You have a highly competent worker who can assemble 50 parts an hour, and you have a slower worker who can only assemble 10 parts an hour.
Okay, a clear disparity in skill or effort.
Right. Under a system of equal opportunity, you pay the faster worker more, or you train the slower worker to improve. But under the doctrine of equity, which demands equal outcomes, the factory manager decides the disparity itself is proof of oppression.
So what does the manager do?
Instead of elevating the slow worker, the manager literally jams the gears of the conveyor belt. He limits the maximum speed of the belt so that nobody can assemble more than 10 parts an hour.
Wow.
The competent worker is physically prevented from excelling. The factory eventually goes bankrupt and everyone loses their jobs, but the manager celebrates because the spreadsheet shows perfect, equitable mediocrity.
And if that competent worker points out that the disparities in output might actually reflect differences in his own effort, his discipline, his risk tolerance, or his years of practice, rather than some invisible systemic oppression, he is immediately denounced.
He's the bad guy.
The word privilege is deployed as a silencing spell. Riker writes that the moment the word privilege is uttered, the target's empirical evidence, logical reasoning, and lived experience are expected to simply evaporate on command.
Which brings us to the most intimate battlefield, the family duct. How does this ideology target the nuclear family? Riker spends a lot of time detailing how second-wave feminism allied itself deliberately with socialist organizations to achieve this.
They adopted the exact dialectical structure of Marxist class warfare, but they mapped it directly onto the living room.
So who plays what role in the living room?
In this new domestic framework, women are cast as the oppressed proletariat, men are cast as the bourgeois oppressor class, and the traditional nuclear family is designated as the primary site of capitalist exploitation.
And the logical conclusion of that framework is that the state must intervene to liberate the oppressed from the oppressor.
Yes, in doing so, the state forcefully positions itself as the new husband and the new father.
The state replaces the man.
Exactly. The traditional biological father, the man who acts as the independent steward, provider, and protector of his household, is viewed as inherently dangerous to the bureaucratic state.
Why dangerous?
Because he governs a private sphere. He provides for his dependents without relying on state welfare, and he answers to a higher moral order than the state's ledger. He is an independent node of power.
So, to eliminate that independent power, the system recodes him. Riker outlines how the father is reduced from a protector to two things: a taxable paycheck and a presumed threat.
Fatherhood is rewritten not as a biological and moral bond, but as a perpetual patriarchal debt that must be heavily regulated.
Regulated by who?
The biological father is conceptually recast as a dominant abuser whose authority must be aggressively confiscated by a sprawling network of family court judges, child protective agencies, and school counselors.
This loops us right back to the horrific anecdote in the preface. The guy who built the business, coached the baseball team, and lost his children, his house, and his savings in 72 hours based on a single paragraph.
It's all connected.
Riker points out how the machinery uses pre-loaded language to ensure this outcome every time. Words like safety, harm, and impact.
The strategic redefinition of these words is the very mechanism of administrative conquest. When a flat, factual correction from a male colleague in a meeting is recast as aggression, or when a conservative professor assigning a classical text is labeled as causing literal harm that requires administrative intervention, the trap is sprung.
The therapeutic state has entirely colonized the hard, objective power of the law. Due process, which relies on evidence and objective standards, is entirely displaced by emotional regulation, which relies solely on the subjective feelings of the designated victim class.
That is the new legal standard. Feelings.
There is a sentence in the book that hit me like a freight train. Quote, "Rule by complaint. Governance by accusation, law displaced by therapy. End quote.
It perfectly summarizes the modern condition.
If you are a man listening to this and you are seeing this creeping vine of resentment choking the life out of your workplace, invading the family courts, and dictating the terms of your culture, you are undoubtedly asking the ultimate question right now. What does Conrad Riker say a man can actually do about it?
This is where Riker pivots the book from a dark historical diagnosis to a highly practical prescription. He calls this final phase the masculine praxis.
The masculine praxis.
Yes. The core philosophy here is moving out of a state of passive suffering and stepping into a state of active, ordered authority.
Because Riker is brutally clear about one thing. You cannot meme your way out of this.
No, posting online won't save you.
You cannot just sit around in internet forums complaining about how the system is rigged. You have to take concrete action in the physical world, and that action starts with a massive realization. Modern consumerism is the leash around your neck. You are voluntarily funding the very machine that is grinding you into dust.
This is the principle of the consumer leash. Riker argues that the modern therapeutic state doesn't possess a traditional standing army. It cannot draft soldiers or seize physical territory by force.
But it doesn't need to.
Right, because it purchases compliance with breathtaking, terrifying efficiency. And the critical question is, where does it get the billions of dollars required to fund this apparatus?
It gets it from the consumer at the very bottom of the pyramid. It extracts it from the competent men who buy the running shoes, pay the exorbitant university tuitions, and subscribe to the streaming services.
He calls this process the audit, and he provides incredibly specific corporate examples to illustrate the pipeline. He tells the reader to follow the money to its absolute terminus.
Give us some of those examples.
You buy a cup of coffee from a massive national chain. A percentage of that profit goes to their corporate philanthropic foundation. That foundation then distributes multi-million-dollar grants to NGOs that actively promote legal frameworks designed to reframe fatherhood as absenteeism in the family courts.
So you are literally paying to have your rights stripped away. Or consider the other specific examples he names in the text. Corporate foundations donating heavily to Planned Parenthood.
Right. Riker argues that this organization has spent decades actively lobbying against paternal rights and reproductive decisions, while simultaneously championing ideological reprogramming in public schools.
He also mentions Target. He points out their financial support for GLSEN, an organization dedicated to pushing highly controversial gender ideology into elementary education.
It's all funded by consumer dollars.
He points to Disney publicly vowing to use its corporate weight to fight parental rights legislation in Florida, which was essentially a massive corporation declaring that parents should not have the ultimate authority over what their young children are taught about sex and gender.
And he even calls out Nike, a company that built a global empire by celebrating raw male athletic achievement, now running marketing campaigns that pathologize male competitive drive as a form of toxic emotional damage.
The genius of this architecture is that it is invisible by design, isn't it? When you swipe your credit card at the checkout screen, it doesn't show you an itemized receipt of the political expenditures attached to your purchase.
But Riker's arithmetic on this is brutal and uncompromising.
Yeah.
Every single dollar you spend at a hostile institution is a bullet you're purchasing for the gun that is currently pointed at your own head.
Your intent when buying the coffee or the shoes is completely irrelevant to the ledger. The machine only cares about the capital.
Exactly. So what is the actual praxis? What is the practical application of this knowledge?
Radical economic divestment.
Yes. Riker instructs men to sit down and literally audit their bank statements for the last 3 months. Look at every recurring charge, every entertainment subscription, every major household purchase.
And apply what he calls the institutional interrogatory. Does the entity receiving this money use a portion of its profits to fund the apparatus of anti-male grievance?
And if the answer is yes, which, let's be honest, it is for the vast majority of major consumer brands, tech monopolies, and entertainment platforms, what do?
You shut the wallet, you cancel the subscription.
And Riker is very careful to distinguish this from a standard boycott. This is not a symbolic, temporary boycott designed to generate a performative apology from a CEO.
Right, no hashtags.
He explicitly distances this praxis from performative awareness campaigns or solidarity hashtags on social media. It's a cold, calculated material act designed to sever a supply line.
When you stop feeding the parasite that is eating you, the parasite weakens.
The radical NGO doesn't get its grant. The university diversity department cannot justify filling its open position. You are quite literally starving the vine of its necessary fertilizer.
Okay, so that handles the economic front. Stop funding your own destruction. But Riker also provides a profound philosophical and linguistic defense. He calls it dismantling the vine with logos, the word, reason, logic. Mechanically, this means absolutely refusing to adopt the vocabulary of the oppressor.
This is the linguistic defense, and it requires immense moral clarity and personal courage. Riker understands that every major conflict is waged over labels and definitions long before the main battle begins.
If you accept the enemy's definitions, you have already lost the debate.
Exactly. So, when an HR committee or a social media mob accuses you of privilege, you do not apologize. You stop the conversation in its tracks, and you calmly demand that they define the term precisely.
Yes. You force them to articulate the mechanics of their accusation. When they throw out a phrase like disparity proves discrimination, you ask them directly if that exact same logic applies to disparities in personal effort, disparities in risk tolerance, or disparities in time preference.
Puts the burden of proof back on them.
When they deploy a heavy word like exploitation, you ask them to clarify. Was the transaction voluntary? Did the employer assume financial risks that the worker did not? Did the worker explicitly agree to the compensation?
You pin the term to the wall. You hold it perfectly still and you watch it collapse under objective inspection. Because the entire Marxist and intersectional apparatus depends entirely on slippery emotional words that evaporate the moment they are defined with precision and tested against real-world examples.
The ideology cannot survive contact with objective logic.
No, it cannot.
Riker's advice here is so bracing. Stop apologizing for your virtues. Stop interpreting institutional hostility as proof of your own personal moral failure. Demand hard evidence before you grant anyone moral authority over you.
And perhaps most importantly, Riker says, stop pronouncing the lie as truth.
What does that mean in practice?
The modern commissar doesn't actually need your private conviction. He needs your public performance. Every single time you nod along with a pronoun protocol that you know is biologically false, or every time you sign a corporate loyalty oath to a diversity statement just to keep your job, you are personally adding a brick to the prison that the system will eventually use to lock up your son.
That is a chilling thought. The system has built its entire architecture on the assumption of compliance. It has absolutely no mechanism for processing a man who simply looks at the HR committee, looks at the hashtag mob, or looks at the campus tribunal and states what actually happened in plain, objective words without a hint of apology.
A man who flatly refuses to play the assigned role of either victim or oppressor breaks the machine.
Which leads us to the final, most hopeful step of the praxis, building parallel structures. Because it's not enough to just audit your bank account and divest from the corrupt system. You have to redirect that liberated capital and energy into something new.
Exactly. Riker envisions a future where competent men direct their capital, their labor, and their loyalty toward local craftsmen, independent farmers, and decentralized communities built on classical, enduring goods.
Merit, physical reality, earned hierarchy.
Every single dollar diverted from a hostile multinational corporation to a neighborhood hardware store or a local butcher is a dollar removed from the engine of cultural destruction and placed directly into the foundation of cultural rebuilding.
You essentially build the shadow architecture of a sane society right under their noses. You teach your children that feelings are not facts. You teach your sons that courage is not toxicity, and that the desire to protect and provide is a virtue, not a patriarchal pathology.
Riker paints this incredibly vivid final image of a man standing in a physical workshop that he built with his own two hands, watching the digital administrative institutions of the old world decay around him because they simply cannot consume him anymore.
It is a vision of active, ordered, masculine authority. The vine of resentment, by its very nature, can only consume. It lacks the capacity to produce anything of value. It parasitizes the host.
But when the host finally stops consenting, when the competent men stop providing the financial and moral fuel, the vine inevitably collapses under its own hollow weight.
Okay, as we wrap up this incredibly intense, expansive deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over. It builds directly on Riker's work, but let's take it a step further out of the theoretical and into the brutal physical reality of the world we live in. If this vine of resentment successfully chokes out all the competent builders, if the concept of objective merit is entirely replaced by intersectional identity quotas, and if the basic act of demanding excellence is viewed as an oppressive microaggression, who is going to maintain the physical infrastructure of civilization?
That is the ultimate question.
Who maintains the high-voltage electrical grids? Who calibrates the municipal water purification systems? Who calculates the sheer load-bearing stress on the steel bridges that you and your family drive across every single day?
That is the ultimate, unavoidable collision between utopian ideology and physical reality.
Exactly. A society that actively rewards emotional fragility and systematically punishes technical competence isn't just morally bankrupt in some abstract philosophical sense. Eventually, the lights physically go out, the water stops flowing, the bridge actually collapses.
The real world doesn't care about the narrative.
The ultimate, unyielding revenge of reality is that gravity, thermodynamics, and structural engineering do not care about your grievances. The X-ray shows the broken bone whether you feel oppressed by the doctor or not. The universe demands competence, and no amount of HR seminars can alter the laws of physics.
As a final reminder to our listeners, today we have been exploring the highly controversial, deeply structured historical arguments of Conrad Reicher's book. As always, we have acted purely as an analytical mirror to the text, dissecting its mechanics and exploring its history without endorsing its political conclusions. We're just conveying the ideas of the source material.
If this deep dive resonated with you, if you found yourself nodding along, realizing you finally have the map and the vocabulary to see these institutional mechanisms operating in your own life, you need to read this text for yourself. Buy the ebook on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
It is a dense, challenging, and meticulously researched read that demands careful contemplation.
And before you log off, please take a second to like and subscribe to our show. It is the only way we can keep these deep dives going. And be absolutely sure to follow the author for his ongoing real-time analysis at his Substack, @Conrad Reicher, and on YouTube @Conrad Reicher. Take back your reality, audit your lives, and stand firm in your competence. We'll see you on the next deep dive.